What's up, Buckeye fans? Welcome to the Bucknuts Happy Hour. I'm Patrick Murphy here, and we are going to talk some Buckeyes, some of the standouts from spring practice as we sort of wrap on that and head into the off season. On today's show, I will be running this one alone. I apologize that we don't have a guest this weekend, but hopefully I can entertain enough. As always, if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe or hit that like button. If you're listening to the podcast version of this, please like, subscribe, all that. Wherever you're doing it, that all helps a lot. 5-star reviews. It helps get our show out there for even more people. And that is, let's be honest, that's what we want. If you are watching with us live, feel free to throw questions, comments in the comment section. We will get to those towards the end. We will have time throughout. And I imagine today's topic will have some differing of opinions as we go through it. So feel free to throw those in there and I'll address those. I have no problem discussing what people think about my thoughts and others. So today's happy hour, we're doing something a little different. No beer today. I'm actually just out of beer, if I'm being honest. I wanted to come up with some reason why I'm drinking a Sun Cruiser iced tea vodka, peach flavored, but it's really just I didn't have beer in the fridge. We were out of town, and so haven't filled it as normal. So we're gonna go with what's there. And if I remember correctly, these are pretty good. Haven't had one in a while. The fiance drinks these from time to time, but I think they're pretty good. So cheers. Let's see. Oh yeah, not bad at all. We can deal with that. We'll make that work in lieu of beer this week. Okay, so what I want to talk about today, as I sort of mentioned, are we'll say 10. I have a few others that I might mention, players that stood out during Ohio State spring practice. And these are players that stood out to me from the times that we were at Ohio State's practice. We got to watch, I think, parts of 2 practices and then a full Student Appreciation Day practice, and then obviously the spring game. So this is what I saw. I am one person. I only have 2 eyes. So there are going to be things that I did not see. Obviously, I've talked with our coworkers, Dave Biddle, Steve Hellwagon, about stuff they saw. We obviously talked with coaches and players throughout spring. So there will be some influence there in terms of who stood out to me, but this is just my list. I think if you were to poll other people on the Ohio State beat, there would probably be some differences, but this is the list that I saw, and I tried to order these 10 guys from 1 to 10, and I kept kind of arguing with myself, so I decided no order for this. We're gonna go. There's one is not more standout than the other necessarily in this. Just kind of the list as they came to me as I was thinking about this last night and this morning. Cheers. And again, if you're watching this live, you have some guys you thought stood out, whether you're from stuff you read, watching the spring game, whatever, throw that in the comment section. If you disagree with me on somebody, feel free to throw that in there. I love to have some banter. If you have questions about the Buckeyes, about college football, college sports in general, feel free to throw those in there too. We should have time at the end. We're not going to go as long as we have in the past. And also, what do you think about this background if you're watching this live? This little tree thing? I've been watching The Last of Us on HBO, and it kind of reminded me of that. So as I cycle through these backgrounds, I was like, oh, that's fitting. So let's get into it because I know people don't care that much about the other stuff. I'm going to start with a player who had playing time last year and probably isn't a surprise that he had a good spring, but that's Austin Searveld, the offensive lineman. And I should say that some of these guys will be standout because I didn't expect them to have the spring that they had, or at least from what I saw. Some of it will be that I did expect it and they lived up to expectations. So I'll kind of go through why for each guy. But for Austin Searveld, obviously a guy who played a good amount last season and his first real playing time for the Buckeyes, started some games at guard, rotated, was part of that 3-man rotation at guard last season in the college football playoff with Taker Shabola and Luke Montgomery. But in spring, he bumped out to right tackle. And had you asked me before spring practice started, like who I thought was going to be Ohio State's right tackle coming out of spring, it certainly wouldn't have been Austin Searveld. In fact, when we first walked in there, I think it was the first day of spring when we got to watch summer practice for the first time, and Austin Searveld was working at right tackle. That caught my attention right away. So this was something I kind of paid attention to throughout when we were there. And I was really impressed with what Austin was able to do at that position. He's a guy, I've spoken with him a couple times now about this. He's a guy in high school who moved around a lot, even within games on the offensive line. So he said last year, switching from right and left guard really wasn't as big of a deal for him as maybe it was for some other people who'd never done that before. But moving out to tackle is a bit of a different beast. And obviously we haven't seen him in a real game yet. So, reserve judgment. But I think coming out of spring, if you were to say the Buckeyes played a game on Saturday, who's your starting offensive line? I think, well, we know because Ryan Day said it when we spoke with him earlier this week that Austin Searveld would be a part of that. But I think he would be the starting right tackle right now. And that's not to say things won't change, but that is not something I expected going into spring practice. So for me, Austin Searveld stood out. I thought he looked good there. I didn't ever feel like, he's out of place. That's a guy who's still learning the position after playing guard for the last couple of years. I felt like, again, it was a productive spring for Austin Searveld, and I thought he held his own. And so I think, he's certainly someone who was high on my list. Like I said, from day one going out for spring practice, when everyone noticed he was at right tackle, it was like, let's keep an eye on that and let's see how he does at that position. And I think it was a successful spring for him. So props to Austin Searveld. Cheers. The first guy on my list, not necessarily number one. As I said, these aren't in a specific order, just kind of how they came to me. We'll stay on the offensive side of the ball here, and I will go with Lincoln Kienholz. And this, again, I think that the long kind of last image we had of Lincoln Kienholz, especially for fans, but even for those of us in the media who do get to see some of practice, like that memory of the Cotton Bowl was kind of hard to shake because it was, a poor effort offensively by the Buckeyes. This wasn't all on Lincoln Kienholz. He got thrust in there after Devin Brown got hurt, and the offensive line was kind of a makeshift group. He was not ready to play in that game, but had to play a good amount and was, let's be honest, not great. So I think you go into last year, he doesn't play very much, obviously behind three other quarterbacks. And so coming into spring, we've talked about this before, the assumption Julian Sain's going to be the guy. I don't think anyone really expected that to be announced by the end of spring practice, but I do think that's what most people expected was, okay, Julian Sain, he's the heir apparent to Will Howard. Lincoln Kienholz, as I've touched on quite a bit, really made this a competition. He could have just accepted it. He could have entered the transfer portal. He could have done a lot of things. Instead, he put on a really good performance in the parts of spring practice that we got to see. I'm sure you guys have heard about it by now, but the one scrimmage we did get to watch for Student Appreciation Day, Lincoln Kienholz was the best quarterback out there. From talking to other people, and I know it's been reported elsewhere, Buckeyes had another scrimmage that wasn't open to the media or fans, students, and by all accounts, Lincoln Kienholz was the best quarterback that day as well. The spring game, Lincoln Kienholz started off a little rough. He began the game, I think, 1 of 3 passing, and had a couple struggles there early on, but finished the game. I'm looking to pull up the stats here. Finished the game. If this will load. He finished the game 12 of 18 for 158 yards and 2 touchdowns. So, starting off 1 of 3, that's a pretty good response from Lincoln Kienholz. I thought for a guy who is pegged as being more of an athlete and less as a passer, I thought he looked really good with that passing aspect. I think you could see the growth in these last couple of years of being in the program and being in the quarterback room with some really talented guys. Say what you will about Kyle McCord and his year at Ohio State, like still a productive season for Kyle. He could learn from Kyle. And then obviously Will Howard last year, even Devin Brown to some degree. So I think Lincoln Kienholz has made quite the leap. I know everyone talks about the fact that he was this dual threat, guy who also played basketball and baseball in high school. I do think the time focusing just on football has been big for him and has allowed him to grow and learn the playbook and things like that. And I think that was an advantage he had over the other two quarterbacks in the room, is just he'd been there longer, knew the offense better, things like that. And I thought he really stood out. Do I think he's going to win the job ultimately? No, I still think it's going to be Julian Sayin, but I think Lincoln Kienholz really made this a competition, and there is reason that it's carrying over into the summer and then into fall camp. And it's not just lip service by Ryan Day wanting to keep Lincoln Kienholz at Ohio State and not let him enter the transfer portal. He looked really good, I thought. And if you told me that Lincoln Kienholz was the day one starter, if he goes out and has a really good fall camp and is the starter against Texas, I would be a little surprised, just because I do think it's going to be Julian Sayin, but I wouldn't be shocked, because what I saw this spring was a guy who I think is ready to play football at this level. And, I think is really, really capable of contending for this starting job. So he was another guy who was a standout for me. Cheers. We'll flip over to the defensive side now. And this is a name that's not going to surprise anybody, but Jermaine Matthews Jr., the cornerback. Obviously, you guys have seen him in games quite a bit over the last couple of seasons. He started the Penn State game 2 years ago when Denzel Burke was out. He worked his way into a rotational role as the third cornerback, sometimes even seeming like the second cornerback last season, kind of the second half of last season. And the Texas game, the playoff semifinal, played the entire second half. So, not a guy that I think needed to prove anything. What he needed to do was continue to build on what he'd already accomplished at Ohio State, knowing that Denzel Burke is now gone and that spot is open, and just ensure that you grab that spot and make it your own at the cornerback position. But first of all, I thought Jermaine Matthews did all that. I thought he looked good. The Student Appreciation Day practice, he had an interception. I think it was on Julian Sayin, if I remember correctly, but comes streaking across the field to make the pick. Just a real athletic play, understanding where he needs to be and kind of reading the quarterback's eyes. I think that's good from a guy who, yes, he's played a decent amount, but hasn't started a ton. So still room to grow. Right. But then also he was not just playing outside corner. He played some nickel, the practice right before the spring game. I know he was going back and forth from those spots, from nickel to outside corner. And I think that's an interesting thing to keep an eye on, is once we get to fall camp. Is that the Buckeyes solution to sort of replacing Jordan Hancock, who is, we talked about last week before the NFL draft? That's a guy who is going to be vital to replace, kind of an unsung hero on Ohio State's defense the last couple of years, and is the best option playing Jermaine Matthews, in that nickel spot sometimes. And you've got quite the bit of yes, unproven, but talented depth at corner. Is he the best? Is there another guy who makes more sense to play at outside corner when you have those guys on the field, and move Jermaine Matthews into the nickel at times? And then you can also bump him outside when you need. And I think he showed during spring that he is capable of doing both of those roles. And I think that is only going to up his value, not just for Ohio State next season, maybe the season beyond, depending on what Jermaine Matthews decides to do. But in the NFL, if you can be more versatile, it's only going to help teams, right? And I think he showed that during spring. Now, again, like with all these guys, most of these guys, I should say, he's going to have to do that once the games start. You're going against a different opponent. You don't know the offense as well. All those things like this, he obviously is going to have to prove that he can play both spots. But I thought Jermaine Matthews did exactly what you needed to see from him to be like, yes, that's your starter to replace Denzel Burke. And also maybe he can do some other things that we weren't thinking about going into this offseason. And, like you said, the more versatility you can provide to a team, the better. So I think that the range of options that Jermaine Matthews Jr. may give you is more than I would have expected. Yes, I thought, okay, he's the next up for Denzel Burke. He's going to be a shutdown corner on the outside. Maybe he's the next great Ohio State corner, and we go from there. But now he gives you some different options. And if he's in that nickel spot, can he maybe do some safety things like we saw Jordan Hancock do in the second half of last season? Is that stuff they try with him or not? And look, there are other options at the nickel. I don't want to make it sound like there aren't, but the fact that we did see him there, I thought was interesting and relevant going forward. So cheers to Jermaine. The next guy, going back to offense, running back James Peoples. And again, this is a guy who played a little bit his freshman season, but didn't see a ton and heard a lot of good things. When he was in the game, the however many snaps, I don't have the snap count in front of me, but however many snaps he did play was productive, scored a touchdown on his first touch as a Buckeye in college. So a guy that everyone kind of expected, he'll step in. He can be a contributor at the very least. And obviously they bring in CJ Donaldson as well from West Virginia. So, with Quinshawn and Travion going on to the NFL, this is a guy you can put in and expect to do good things. But again, hadn't seen much of it, right? And so now you are going into this offseason. You need a new starter. You have CJ Donaldson coming in, and James Peoples, I thought, was the best running back during spring. I think you saw what made him so good throughout the recruitment process and the Buckeyes being excited about him going forward into this year as their running back, as one of two running backs, maybe more, one of two, one of three, we'll see. But he, I thought, was really impressive. And Ryan Day's talked about the fact that you can't really judge running backs too much until you start really hitting and tackling. And you saw it in the spring game. They didn't really do much with either running back. But I think when we did see that and the Buckeyes did go live, which we did get to see a couple times in spring practice, I thought he looked the part. And, the comparisons, Denzel Burke, I think it was somebody at the combine, maybe it's Denzel Burke, comparing him to J.K. Dobbins. I could see why there's that comparison there. That's a lot to put on a kid, but there's certainly the opportunity, size, all that stuff. I think that, he fits what the Buckeyes want from at least one of their running backs next year. And look, if he'd come out and struggled in spring, then you're like, well, what are you going to do? What are you going to do at running back? You just had two great running backs. Now do you have one? I think that question is, or if you had that question, it's probably answered, because I think James Peoples showed during spring, yes, I get to, I have the ability to do what the Buckeyes need. Going back to the defensive side of the ball, maybe a guy we didn't talk about enough, and maybe I should have. I had a podcast a couple weeks ago, a happy hour, where we did guys didn't get talked about, but Kenyatta Jackson, I thought, had a pretty good spring. And this is a guy who's been in the program for 3 years now, right? And has played, but was a backup behind Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau. There wasn't a huge rotation between those three, or between, with those guys off the field. So he didn't get to play a ton, but, size, what's he listed at here? 6'6", 258, longer arms. The potential is there, right? And I think you need to see that come to fruition this season. And I thought spring was a good step. I thought there were plays that he made in practice. Now, the quarterbacks weren't always live, but he's getting into the backfield. He's having some success, and I think that's a positive step for his future going into next season. The Buckeyes need, you lose guys like JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer, who really came on, especially over the second half of their season. I think that he's a guy who is obvious to step in, just given some of his his pedigree, I guess I would say, but you need to see the production and you need to start seeing him get pressure on quarterbacks and things like that in spring practice. I thought he did that. I will admit, like with all of these guys, but especially with defensive linemen, like we're only there for a small amount of time. So like you can have a couple good days and maybe we just see it. But I think Kenyatta Jackson had a good overall spring, and that's a positive for Ohio State because you do lose two really productive guys at Jack Sawyer and JT Tuimoloau. So I think that's somebody who, yes, he's not a new name. He's not an up and coming guy. And I think those guys tend to get some of the excitement. And I'll follow that up in a second with a guy that I think will, because he's new. But Kenyatta Jackson, just because he's been in the program and hasn't played doesn't mean he's not talented. He was just behind two really good guys. And I think you saw in spring, if you were watching a lot, that there is a real player there. So positive news for the Buckeyes. Cheers to Kenyatta. Speaking of new guys, Logan George, staying in the same position at defensive end. And I think there is excitement about him because he is this new guy who was productive at Idaho State. And, obviously you have to step up a level going from not only FCS to FBS, but all the way up to the Big Ten and to the defending national champion. So that's a big jump. That was my big question coming into spring. Like, is this a guy who can even contribute this year? Is this more of a, let's see what happens with him? We like the player type of thing. Or can you get something out of him as a first year guy? And I think you saw that you could get something out of him as a first year guy, no doubt about it. Is he a guy who's going to step in and start? I doubt it. I think that he's probably going to be part of that rotation at defensive end. But there were very positive signs. You saw it in the spring game. Now, I do think, and I've seen a lot of talk about his spring game performance, but he was going up against the second string offensive line, maybe even the third string at times. I'd have to go back and look. So you expect him to be able to handle that as an experienced guy, even a guy who's still trying to make that jump. But I do think when we're talking about making that jump from FCS to FBS, have to remember this is a guy similar to Will Kazmarek, who was being recruited during the COVID years when it was tough to get a good evaluation on a lot of guys. And who knows if the pandemic doesn't happen, if guys like Will Kazmarek or Logan George end up, going to a bigger school quicker. Obviously Will Kazmarek still ended up at Ohio University, so he wasn't at the FCS level. But like those are guys that maybe if they get more evaluation, if teams are able to evaluate them more, I guess I should say, maybe they end up at a higher level. And we'll see. I think Will Kazmarek still has more to prove, but I thought he had a good first year. Logan George, I thought in the spring, looked good. So I think that's a positive step, adds some depth at defensive end. And just, when we were out there, he tended to make plays and even just drills when we were watching him, like didn't look out of place. And I think from a guy who's making that jump up, that's important. I think he fit right in, again, size wise, 6'4", 250, you'll take that. No problem. And I think he's only going to get stronger, faster, all that stuff working with, Ohio State's staff. Flipping back to the offensive side of the ball and going back to the offensive line, Ethan Onyanwa, he's a guy we've talked about a lot, right? When he committed to Ohio State out of the transfer portal, he was a guy who I think most people looked at and were like, okay, this is going to be one of your tackles. Him and Phillip Daniels were the two transfer portal guys. They needed tackle help. And you just kind of expect that a guy like that is going to, cheers to Logan George, by the way. You bring him in. He's a guy who doesn't have, multiple years to play and things like that. So, okay, let's pencil him in, but you got to earn it. And when we first got out to spring practice, and this was kind of to be expected, Ethan Onyanwa was working with the second team. And I think he had to show enough to prove that he belongs at that left tackle spot. And I think he did. Are there still things he needs to work on? Yes. I think he would tell you that. I think the coaching staff would tell you that. there is still room for improvement there. And I don't think anyone would say that he's locked up that left tackle job, but I think he left spring probably the favorite to win it. He was the starter in the spring game at left tackle. So that's a positive for Ohio State. Obviously a huge position, both physically and, just the role. So you need a guy who earns that job. No one's just going to be given jobs anywhere, but specifically at a position as crucial as that. And I think Ethan Onianwa took some very positive steps in doing that. Again, like Logan George, I don't think he was out of place necessarily playing. Were there moments where it wasn't perfect? Yes, but there were also moments where he did a good job blocking some of these defensive ends coming off the edge. So I think that's a very positive thing if you are Ohio State, because if he'd remained with the second string and had some issues and, whatever it may be, what are you going to do? Do you have to go to the portal again this after spring? Do you have to just kind of hope he develops or someone else develops into your left tackle? I mean, that's not a position you want to be in coming out of spring practice is, oh shit, who's our left tackle? And not that Ohio State knows for sure that he's going to be the guy, but I think they feel pretty good about, okay, we've got a guy here that we can work with and get him to where he needs to be the starter week one. And I think that's about as much as you were going to ask as from a guy transferring from Rice. Not the FCS to FBS level of Logan George, but still a jump up in competition and things like that. And I think he looked the part of a guy who can play that position for Ohio State. So cheers to Ethan Onianwa. Again, I see that we've got more people that have jumped in to this live. If you have questions, comments, as we go through the players that stood out to me, maybe not to everybody, but the ones that I thought stood out, throw those in the chat. We can debate. We can have some discussion here after I'm done with my list. Also, if you have any other questions, Ohio State, football, basketball, college sports in general, feel free to throw those in there. I will. This is not going to be as long of a show as normal, so we definitely will have time. Okay, let's see. Where were we here? Okay, I saw we had somebody mention this already, so I'll throw this up here. There it is. Will Starr. Peyton Pierce. I agree. I know Dave Biddle has been very high on Peyton Pierce. He's talked about him a lot, so I'm not trying to steal Dave's thunder. James Laurinaitis also talked up Peyton Pierce when we spoke with him. But you have your two starters. You've got Sonny Styles, who thought had a good spring, didn't do a ton because he didn't need to. And then you have Arvell Reese, again, productive spring, going to step in. Those are going to be your two starters. But now you have a third guy. And look, I don't think Ohio State, and this may be where Dave and I disagree a little bit, which is fine, but I don't think Ohio State's going to play a lot of three linebacker sets. I just don't think in today's college football that makes a lot of sense. There will be times that happens, but I think for the most part, Peyton Pierce is that number three guy. And I think you saw last year with Arvell Reese, or Cody Simon being out and things like that, that role is still important. Is it an every down player? No. But if you don't have that guy, what do you do when you do need to go to three linebackers? What do you do if somebody, rips a shoestring and needs to come out of the game? What do you do if somebody gets hurt? Well, I think Ohio State, James Laurinaitis, Matt Patricia can sleep a little bit easier knowing that you have somebody like Peyton Pierce who, did get a good amount of run because Sonny Styles didn't play a ton. Even Arvell Reese, I felt like they didn't push too far or push too hard, I would say, in the spring, knowing what he's going to have to endure this fall. And so Peyton Pierce got some run. I thought was good, really good out there. Again, running backs and things, if you're not always tackling guys, it's sometimes difficult to get a read. But I thought when Ohio State was hitting and things like that, Peyton Pierce looked the part of a linebacker. And I think you can expect him to not only contribute this year, but then in next season and maybe beyond, you have a guy who then is the next man up. And that's important. Like Arvell Reese stepping in this offseason. You need a guy who's ready to go. Sonny Styles is gone after this season. Now you have a guy who can potentially step in and replace him. All right, we're getting close here. Next guy I will mention is Bo Jackson, the freshman running back. And cheers to Peyton Pierce. Whenever we saw the Buckeyes scrimmage, do some 7-on-7, 11-11, really 11-on-11 type stuff, it was when the third team offense was out there, I thought Bo Jackson, even when sometimes they worked him in with some of the second string, maybe even the first string. I thought Bo Jackson looked ready to go. And again, like I said earlier, with James Peoples, the evaluation on running backs is tough this time of year. And again, Ryan Day has talked about that. But I thought he looked like a guy who, I guess if you were to walk into practice and you didn't know much about this roster, or if you watched the spring game and you didn't know much about this roster, I think you would have been surprised to find out that Bo Jackson was a freshman playing in, his first time playing with college football. The spring game alone, pulling up the stats here again. Where'd it go? That's receiving. He had Bo Jackson, 13 carries, 88 yards, and a touchdown. I think he showed some power. I think he showed explosiveness. There was a play during the Student Appreciation Day practice where he, got to the outside and just kind of, once he got to the edge, just kind of took off. I don't think he scored on that play, but I think he got the Buckeyes down like inside the 5, inside the 10. It was a nice play, like good recognition, good patience, kind of bump it outside and then go. Again, talking like I was with Peyton Pierce, what is Bo Jackson's role this season? I don't know. I've talked about it before. Like, to me, the 2 running back rotation makes sense. Like, both guys stay happy. You get a lot of playing time for both of them, but you keep them fresh. I think last year was the blueprint for what you want to do with these guys. But if a third guy works his way in, and if Bo Jackson is just good enough to fight his way in there, I think you have to consider it, right? And I think at least in spring, he made the argument that that is possible. And running back is a position where, as a true freshman, you can play right away. Like, yes, you have to work on pass protection and some of the blocking stuff, and that you're asked to do a little bit more than you usually were in high school. But I think this is a guy who has all the tools to at least be a part of this offense in some degree this year, even if it is, the third running back who, only comes in when needed or late in games, things like that. Maybe he plays about what James Peoples did last year. Maybe he finds a way to play more. We'll see. But I felt very good about what I saw from Bo Jackson. And I think that the future, at very least, is bright for him. And, you're going to lose CJ Donaldson after next season. James Peoples will have another year, but maybe then you have James Peoples and Bo Jackson. James Peoples, assuming he has 2 good seasons, then off to the NFL. Now you've got Bo Jackson and pick your other running backs there that Carlos Lachlan has in that room. But I think it was a really productive start in terms of spring practice for Bo Jackson, who, an Ohio kid. I assume, I think that means a lot to Ohio State fans to have, a local guy. And what a name, by the way. I know it's a nickname, Bo, not his actual name. I forget off the top of my head what his actual name is, but love that. Love that. And I think this is my last one. Just double checking I didn't skip. Yeah, I think I talked about all these guys. The last one, and I don't think this will surprise people given the coverage that he got, but Quincy Porter, the wide receiver, he's just physically looks the part. Ohio State has him listed at 6'4", 205 pounds as a true freshman. It's pretty good. And then when we got to see him play, it was impressive. And, this, again, I go back to the Student Appreciation Day practice. he was out there making plays as, a big time looking receiver. Now, again, a lot of it was against third team defense and things like that, but Ohio State has some really good corners, right? And he's going up against pretty good guys, goes into the spring game, doesn't really get involved until a little bit into the game, but 4 catches on 5 targets for 50 yards. Not a bad debut at the Horseshoe. Again, young guy. You look at the receiving room, it's very talented. There's players with much more experience. Obviously, as a guy that's going to play more on the outside, you got Jeremiah Smith. You've got Carnell Tate as your starters. Mylan Graham is a guy who I didn't include on this list, not because I didn't think he stood out, but I felt like we talked about him a lot. I think people know him, and they know some of these people too, so maybe I could have included him, but I'll talk about that in a second. But, so you've got guys there. So I don't think Quincy Porter is going to necessarily be a guy who breaks out this season. But like I said, with Bo Jackson and some of these other young guys, it's a really good start, to your career, to have a good spring. And, you can't rest on that. You got to keep growing. You got to keep developing all that stuff. But I think he was impressive. And I think, not that this should be a surprise with Brian Hartline and the way he recruits that room, but I think that you're happy to see that there's, another guy down the line that can step in. Carnell Tate, if he has a good year, can head to the NFL after this season. Jeremiah Smith almost certainly will be gone after 2026. So you want to keep that pipeline going, right? And Quincy Porter seems like he's a guy that can step right in there. Doug Shepard said, Lamar Bo Jackson. There you go. So, I think people should be excited about what Quincy Porter is going to give the Buckeyes whenever his opportunity comes. He just seems like the next one. And, we've seen that with guys before, right? We've seen the bits and pieces. And I think you'll see some of that this year at times when he gets the chance to get in games. But so I have a few guys that I will call honorable mention. And some of these guys I just didn't want to include because we talked about him a lot. Like I already mentioned Mylan Graham. Like he's a guy that I've talked about quite a bit. Even before the spring game, we were talking about him. And so I wanted to give some other guys. So maybe the list is a little skewed in that way. But Mylan Graham was one for obvious reasons. Julian Sayin, I didn't want to say Lincoln Kienholz and then not talk about Julian Sayin. Julian Sayin had a good spring. I think those 2 scrimmages wasn't the best quarterback out there, but then the spring game he was. And so if I'm picking one quarterback to be on this list, and not that I decided that, but I thought Lincoln Kienholz stood out more when we were there. Now there were, several other practices that we weren't there for. So, those are different. And if you talk to Ryan Day, even he said before the spring game, he started to think Lincoln Kienholz had a bit of an edge. He said that this week. So Julian Sayin, though, I didn't want to leave him off. And Tavian St. Clair, I also, kind of honorable mention. The expectations are lower than for the other 2, right? Because he's a true freshman coming in. And there were definitely moments where it was like, oh, he's a true freshman. You saw it in the spring game with the 2 interceptions. But the way he bounced back in the spring game, made some big throws, I thought. He did that at times when we were at practice too. I thought his ability to scramble and pick up, he did when we were there for Student Appreciation Day a couple times when protection broke down. So positives for him. Luke Montgomery, he's another guy who, I probably could have included on this list. He's probably the guy right after the top 10 that I had there, coming in, playing guard. I think it was a nice carryover from what he did in the college football playoff, where he eventually becomes the starter at left guard by the national championship game. And I think that position is almost certainly his going into the fall. Bryson Rogers, and I think you can throw Brandon Innes in here too. I just noticed Bryson Rogers a bit more, and maybe it was just because he was out there a little more. Who knows why? But I'm very excited about Brandon Innes. I don't want to take anything away from him, and I think he's going to be a lot of fun in the slot. But Bryson Rogers, I thought, had some good moments during spring practice, and then he starts the spring game, which I did not expect to happen. I don't know. That's something that I'd like to ask about at some point. It was on my list of things to potentially ask Ryan Day about this week, but it was a little bit lower down, and maybe it's not a big deal. We'll obviously find out who is the starter in the slot when we get closer to the season. But that plus some other good plays from Bryson Rodgers, it was like, this is a guy who's not getting talked about enough, probably. And we'll see what that looks like come the fall. But he's another guy on the honorable mentions list. And then Caden Curry as well. There was a thread on Bucknuts on the front row not too long ago talking about defensive line. And there seems to be, I don't know, skepticism about Caden Curry. And I'm not sure why. As a fan, I know you only see so much, and there's not much to see from Caden Curry or Kenyatta Jackson, really. But I think he's a player who can certainly make plays. I think he's going to be a starting defensive end. Obviously the Buckeyes brought in Bo Atkinson from North Carolina, and maybe he works his way into being a starter given his experience. But I like Caden Curry too. When I wrote Kenyatta Jackson down first and kind of got through the list, and I was like, ooh, Caden Curry. So that was part of the reason I did this honorable mentions list, so to speak. And I could probably go through and find a bunch more guys. I was trying to keep it as close to 10, have the 10 and then maybe a few others. But there were definitely other guys, especially play here, play there, guys that weren't out there that much, younger guys, things like that stood out. I wrote a piece shortly after the spring game about newcomers that impressed, guys like Max Clare, who, I think like the spring, if you just watch the spring game, you'd be really impressed with Max Clare. I didn't include him just because he didn't pop to me in the practices as much. But I think he's going to be a big impact guy, give them another weapon in the passing game and things like that. So certainly more guys we could have had on this list. I don't mean to not include anybody, but, I didn't want to just go down the roster or the depth chart and just bring up everybody. So that's my list. Could be right, could be wrong. We'll see as we get closer to the season, but just from watching, listening, talking to people, like those are the guys that sort of popped to me as we kind of went through. Okay, so let me see what we've got here in the comments, questions. I saw some. Oh, cheers to all those guys, by the way. Let's see. Doug Shepard says, I would have thought Ian Moore before Austin Seerveld. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you mean on my list or if you mean him as a starter before Austin Seerveld. But yeah, I mean, he was at left tackle when we walked into spring practice the first day. By the end, it was relegated to, I believe, the second team, but certainly still in the mix there. And again, I don't think anything's done there. But yeah, I would have guessed that him at right tackle, maybe that had to do with, okay, well, we're not just going to throw Ethan Onyanwa into the left tackle spot right away. Okay, let's put Ian Moore there, Austin Seerveld here. Oh, look, we've got something with Austin Seerveld here and something to be excited about. Will Starr asks about the Berm and Austin stuff. I don't really want to get into what's going on at other sites and things like that. But those are two guys that I'm friends with, both of them. I don't know enough about the legal stuff or what happened with the old thing. I know Berm announced this week that he's going over to Buckeye Huddle, which, I like all those guys at Buckeye Huddle. I think Berm does a great job covering recruiting. So I know he's going there. I believe Austin, from my conversations with him, is going to be with Rivals. I don't really know what's happening with their podcast stuff, but yeah, I'm not sure. I've seen a lot of questions. I know a couple weeks ago when this all came out, there were a lot of questions. So I don't want to go into it too much. I don't know enough to go into it too much, but that is what I know. Jermaine H. Runnels, will we see more 3-4 defensive sets than 4-3? I think more, yeah. I think Matt Patricia. So I think the best thing that has stood out about Matt Patricia is that he's going to do, and this is from talking to people that have worked with him, talking to the current staff, things like that. Like, he is going to try and maximize the talent. And whatever that means, does that mean playing 3-4? Well, it depends on how guys are playing. If Kenyatta Jackson, Caden Curry, Bo Atkinson, Logan George, and CJ Hicks are all being productive on the edge, and you don't have the right bodies interiorly, you're probably going to go more 4-3, right? So I think it just depends on what works best. I don't think they're going to force a 3-4 just to do it, if that makes sense. I don't think there's a reason to do that. Buck Rational says, happy Friday, Patrick. Happy Friday to you guys too. Willstar says, Ryan Day is never going to name a starting quarterback this spring due to only 3 quarterbacks on the roster. No way it would take a chance. Yeah, I mean, I think that's a part of it. But like I said with Lincoln, I don't think it was just lip service. And Buck Rational, same thing. If he didn't name Justin Fields a starter in 2019, yeah. I mean, that was the biggest charade. But I don't think that's what this is. I think this is a legitimate competition between 2 guys that are both good. Doug Shepard Sr., Aaron Scott, and Bryce West will provide valuable depth. Yeah, at corner. That's why I think, if Jermaine Matthews is your best option in the slot, I think you probably can, use one of those guys on the outside some and things like that. They are inexperienced for sure, but talented, I think, no doubt. I think that hold on, I'm looking something up here. I think that it's easier probably for young guys, inexperienced guys, I don't want to call them young anymore, to play that outside spot initially, like Jermaine Matthews did. And so if that's the best scenario, then I think that's what you do. And then you put Jermaine Matthews in the slot. You can still move him outside when you want. And I think that versatility is important. Tim Crawford said Donaldson can't stay healthy. So I was pulling up his snap count here, and he played, I think, in every game, but maybe a couple last year for West Virginia. Now he shared the workload the last 2 years. Yeah, same thing. He got hurt, I guess, maybe at the end. The snap count obviously doesn't show injuries. It just shows if he played or not. I haven't heard much about Donaldson having injury issues, no more than any other running back. He played 456 snaps last year, which, let's compare it to Quinshawn. Now, remember, Ohio State played, Quinshawn played 417. So Donaldson played more. Travion played 458. So, yeah, I mean, he played in fewer games. He actually played more snaps than those guys. So I think he's been all right health-wise. Let's see what else we got here. This is interesting from Doug Shepard. The running game will give the defensive lineman time to rest by going on sustained drives. Yeah, I mean, especially with a new first-time, young, inexperienced, whatever you want to call it, starting quarterback, I think you could definitely see them lean on the run more. And, especially if you can really get that going, as they did at times last year. Now, you obviously had Will Howard. And let's remember, you got a lot of weapons that on the outside that are going to want the ball too. But yeah, I think that you could see, and Ohio State went with a slower pace last year intentionally during the season, at least. Let's see what else we got here. Doug says the 3 linebacker sets will get more sacks than the defensive line. That's a bold prediction. Keep that one. Let's remember that, Doug. Let's check back on that later. Remind me that you made that prediction. I want you to remind me whether you're right or wrong when we get later parts, the end of the season last year. If you're right, I'm sure you'll let me hear about it. If you're not, though, I want you to remind me because I may forget. 79 Jedi Buck says people CJ and Bo should be the 3. Yeah, I think that's definitely possible. I just don't know how likely it is. I think they will be the top 3, but how likely it is that you go to a 3rd running back and split carries up even more. Not that Carlos Loughlin is worried about setting these guys up for the NFL, though that is important. But it's about winning. I do think there still is, hey, let's get these guys X amount of carries. I don't think there's a number. That's not the way to put it, but just like you want them to be productive, right? And if you divide it by 3, now they're less productive and maybe not as in rhythm too, which I think is a big thing. Let's see. Brian Henthorn, our elite wide receivers will allow Max Clare to get open. Yeah, this is something I asked Keenan Bailey about, basically, why add, a guy that is a pass catcher to an offense that really doesn't need more pass catchers. And he basically said the same thing, that he thinks it will help, get a guy open because, and give another option to the quarterbacks. So let's see. Eric Turnbull. Finally, somebody realized the 3-4 front needs even more D tackle depth, not less. If anything, it means we won't run. Yeah, I think that's was part of the point I was making there. And I'm not as, I think some people are really concerned about Ohio State at defensive tackle. I think they need to get more depth if the right guy's out there. I think they could just use getting depth, even if it's a guy that you think, and they have looked at guys that maybe are a project. I say project, maybe a year or two away, or they feel like they can work with. But yeah, if you go to a 3-4, you're not playing one defensive tackle and two edge rushers. That's not, you play bigger linemen typically, and then the edge rushers are more stand-up guys. So yeah, I think that is problematic if you don't feel positive about your defensive tackle depth. Tyler Kersley, how would you all feel if we got the number one defense again this year? I think Buckeye fans would feel pretty good about that. I see Doug. Patrick, I'll be lucky if I remember that prediction this evening. All right, fair enough. Hopefully I'll say something that will trigger you to remember, and we can come back to that. Troy V says a couple years ago, Georgia had three backs. They split time in the backfield. That would probably be the model. Yeah, I mean, I think Alabama's done it too. Like there are paths to do it. I mean, Carlos Lachlan has done it at previous stops. So I'm not saying it's out of the question. I think the third running back has to be different than the other two. Like if it's Sam Williams-Dixon, does a freshman Bo Jackson give you something better or different than CJ Donaldson or James Peoples? I don't know. I would say probably not if I had to guess, just because I think he does some of the same things that they can do, but they're more experienced and probably at this point in their career better. Like Sam Williams-Dixon, to me, I'd have to go back and look at Georgia's three backs. I would have to think one of them was more of like the scat back. Like I think back to the New Orleans Saints when they had Darren Sproles. I forget who the other two backs were, but they had, they basically, they had one big power back. They had kind of your kind of more modern back. And then Darren Sproles, who was kind of your, catch passes and quick guy, smaller guy, things like that. Like for me, that's how you would use three backs, not three backs that are basically, two of them, maybe even all three of them are more or less the same. So, that's why I just, I don't see why you would put him. Now, if Bo Jackson is just tearing it up in practice, then yeah, you want to reward a guy who deserves to be on the field. No doubt about that. But if he's doing that, maybe he jumps one of the other guys. Maybe. Again, I'm not ruling it out of the equation. I think it's definitely possible. I just would say, if I'm betting on what's more likely to happen, I would say, excuse me, the running back split would look more like last year with Quinshon Travion than a three running back. But I could be wrong, and that's fine. I've been wrong before. Not often, but Sage Ohio says against Texas, they'll lean mostly on Peoples and Donaldson for experience. Yeah, I think definitely. And then Troy V says, Turbo, you're talking about Turbo Rogers, would be the back that gave a change of pace. Think Bo would be more the same. Yeah, I think so too. But you run into that problem of Rogers not arriving until the summer, doesn't have all spring and things like that. And we know that can often be problematic. So, all right, guys. Well, I'm going to wrap up. I said we weren't going to go all that long or as long as we normally do, and we're almost at 55 minutes. So I was wrong there. I admitted it. Anyway, thank you guys for tuning in. If you're watching this on YouTube, please give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, get notifications. We post all of our videos on there. I know we're at a time of year where we don't have as much. It's outside of the podcast, but we're getting to a point here in June where we'll be doing recruiting camps and things like that with Bill Kurlick. He's already been out. There's some of those videos that will make it on the site as well. So enjoy those. You'll get notifications on that. If you're listening to this on any of your podcast platforms, please subscribe with us. Leave a 5-star review. If you're on Facebook, Twitter, I assume you're already following us. So good job with that. Again, I said this before. If you're not a Bucknuts subscriber, it's a great time to do it. We're about to hit big time recruiting season with the camps and stuff. You're going to want to get your information there throughout the off season, all that. It's a great time to sign up and become a Bucknuts member. Come over to the site, get involved on the message boards. We love to have you there, and you get more of me, Dave, Steve, Bill, all those guys. Anyway, guys, thank you again. Remember, this was my list. It was not a definitive list. It was just the guys that stood out to me. So we'll see how it plays out. Maybe I'll keep this list and Doug, and see if I remember, and see if this plays out the way I think it will. So anyway, cheers. Thanks again. And I'll talk to you guys next week.